welcome to the Earth Feels podcast.
I'm Rose.
And I'm Christine.
Welcome to Earth Feels, the podcast for people feeling overwhelmed by the endlessly gloomy climate news.
Where every week we have soul-based conversations about climate change and explore the idea that climate change may be happening for us as much as it is happening to us.
If you are ready to shift your focus and secure the future for our kids and our grandkids, then this is the podcast for you.
And yes, we do know how to spell. Today's question that Rose and I are going to talk about is, what can one person do? Rose, do you want to start this conversation?
It seems that the road towards transition from where we are to where we need to be includes daily decisions that are within our reach, right? Like driving and flying less, changing to green energy, to a green energy provider, maybe, changing what we can eat and where we buy our things. So I kind of think maybe we should talk about the changes that you and I have made in our lives in the last few years to set an example of some of the things that we feel that are within our reach. Like, I know you drive an electric vehicle. I have not made that transition yet. That's probably the biggest thing we can do is change our consumption of fossil fuels.
Right. In a lot of different ways. I guess I'd like to start the conversation by even saying, so does it make a difference? And I do want to talk about, the personal changes that we've each made, because I find that the changes that I've made or that we've made collectively as a family have made a huge improvement in our quality of life. So I think that's important to kind of
Nice. Yeah.
underscore that I don't feel like I'm suffering because of the changes that I've made. But a lot of people say, well, what difference does it make? What difference does it make if I make changes? And I have to say, this is an ongoing conversation in our household over flying, because flying is a big emissions emitter. And partly, yes, flying is polluting, but it's also the fact that flying has become so common and so cheap that so many more people are doing it.
Yeah, isn't that true? I mean, I think I was 13 years old before I flew.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean, we're old enough to know how rare it was when we were young, and
it was treated as an event. I mean, I think I got a new outfit to fly.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
More of the consumption model, but it was a big deal. And now you're right, it's part of the almost daily. You don't think about how many flights do you make a year? I mean, I probably make 5 round trip flights a year.
Yeah.
A lot.
So this is something, because I've been on this journey since 2009. For a number of years when I was blogging about climate change, I made a commitment not to fly. And I have to say, it caused some unhappiness in my marriage. My husband loves to travel, and although he's concerned about climate change, he would make the point, whether or not you get on that plane, Christine, the plane is still going to leave and it's still going to emit the carbon. So let's go to Europe or, whatever trip we're talking about. And because of the joy, the pleasure that we will get out of it. And it's not going to make a difference in the long term. So I don't know if that's a conversation that you've had or that you've reflected on, but definitely that.
I've definitely reflected on it, because both of my kids live on the West Coast and I live on the East Coast. So the only way for us to see each other, unless I'm willing to take a 2-day train ride, is to fly. As much as I'm dedicated towards making a difference, my kids are my heart, and I'm unwilling to give that up. So, but that being said, when I go to New York, I don't fly anymore. I take the train because it's not that much more time, and it certainly um, is much less carbon.
Hmm. Well, and I have to say, my husband did convince me after probably 3 years of not flying, where he pretty much made the case that he wanted to do it, and he was pretty unhappy that I wasn't, and it's not going to make a difference in the long term. We need system change, not individual
Hmm.
change.
Hmm.
So for a number of years now, I have been flying, and our daughters have been on the West Coast as well, although that has, and we're in the middle of Canada. So we have made compromises where we've flown one way to visit them, and then we've taken the train back and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
But I have to say, we were in British Columbia, again, which is 4 provinces over from where we live, for our daughter's graduation in May. And there was a lot in the news during that time, with Greta Thunberg kind of coming to some prominence, and because, like you, I follow a lot of the climate change news, and it was, I don't remember exactly what was going on, but there was a lot. And as we flew back from that trip, I just felt intuitively, in my heart, this is the last plane trip I'm going to take
Wow.
until we lick this problem, until we
Hmm.
get a handle on climate change. And I made that, had that conversation with my husband again, not happy. So we have come to a compromise, which is that I will fly one flight a year.
Oh,
It's still more carbon, that somebody in China or India emits in 10 years, that one flight. But, and that's just an approximation, but it's a lot of carbon. I do feel like it's important that, for me, I just felt this is a crisis. This is an emergency. I, for myself, have to act like it is. And that is one way that I can do it. But my relationship with my husband is also important. And uh, it's important to him that we still have the possibility of flying. And so that is a compromise. Like all relationships, you compromise. I'm compromising on my climate change activism, but I'm also, keeping a happier husband. So that's our compromise. And in fact, in October, we are flying down to visit our daughter for Thanksgiving. So that's the one flight for the rest of 2019 I'm allowing myself. But that's when I'm going to visit you, think by bus from Toronto down to Massachusetts, and then I'm going to get back home by train. And I happen to love train travel, so it feel like a burden to me. It is more expensive, and so for people with more limited funds, that can be a barrier. But I love train travel. So
yeah. I have to say, the times that I've taken the train down to New York, I find it very relaxing. I mean,
mhm.
it's so many less people are traveling by train than by airport, so it's accessible. You're in and out. You don't have the long lines, the long security lines, and then it lets you out right in the middle of the city, as opposed to having to then jump in a cab or an Uber to get into the city, which is another 40 minutes away. And yeah, it's much more relaxing. It's definitely much less stress inducing. Even to get to the train station from my house, it's not that bad.
And I would just say, for people who are concerned about climate change, to do their own reflection, like
Hmm.
what feels right to you. I mean, there's a study out there. I'm going to find it and put a link on our in this discussion, because it does say that even a Buddhist monk living in the United States, because of the fossil fuel infrastructure that's just built in, even if you lived
Hmm.
as minimalist a way as a Buddhist monk would in the United States, your carbon footprint is still huge.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that, of course, is the study my husband would quote back to me when I would talk about how I didn't want to fly because of its carbon footprint. And then he'd say, well, your carbon footprint is already huge. It's
Well,
not
so then the question becomes how, as we're talking about systemic change versus individual change, and I don't want to get too much into the systemic thing, but because I want to talk about more what we can do individually. But how do we put the pressure on the airlines to at least be offsetting their carbon emissions? I mean, is it a tax on every flight that makes flying more dear to the consumer? What is it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, I'm very much about taxing carbon pollution, which would make flights more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And people haven't yet made the link between paying more now as a price on pollution or paying a lot more in the future when we've got climate chaos and food's going to be more expensive, infrastructure is going to be breaking down. So it's pay now or pay more later. It's not paying at all, but people
Mm-hmm.
haven't made that connection yet.
True.
So, and you can imagine if you told your neighbor or person at the bus stop, well, your next flight to Florida or Mexico is going to cost you $200 more because we need to put a price on carbon pollution. You can see that that wouldn't make you really popular. And of course, I'm exaggerating. You wouldn't start with $200, but people aren't feeling it personally yet. And so it feels very personal when something like the price of something like that's important to them goes up. So of course, I think we need to do that. We need to start at a lower level and ramp up that price on carbon just to encourage people to make the shifts that are needed with an economical sort of carrot and stick rather than
Mm-hmm.
expecting people to make the changes just for the virtue of making the changes, because people have a lot on their plates, and climate change isn't maybe not be as important as their health issues that they're dealing with, or their aging parents, or their child with ADHD or addiction issues, whatever it is. So we just have to acknowledge people have a lot on their plates. We need system change. But this topic today is, what can one person do? And I would say, I think it's so important, if you care about this issue, to turn the focus on what you can do that really resonates with you and that feels important, and not an environmentalist, bless us, because I am one, are often so focused on what other people should do and judging them for it. And even if you're making the changes and you judge the people around you for not doing the same thing that you are, that is not, like, I know where that comes from. It comes from a good place, like you care so deeply, and I say you, and I'm including me in that. Like, one cares so deeply, one wants everybody to get on board, but boy, that can come across as pretty judgmental and unfriendly, and nobody has ever been judged into making important changes in their life.
Yeah, I think it's important to for us, for environmentalists or people that really care about this issue, to just set the example, because there was a study that was done that social scientists found that when one person makes a sustainability oriented decision, other people do too. And an online survey, again, I was doing research. I'm a research fanatic. I was doing some research for this podcast, and an online survey showed that respondents who just knew someone who had given up flying because of climate change, half of them said they flew less as a result.
Wow.
So maybe they're not giving up flights in general, but they are cutting back. And when it comes back to it, I think everything that we do makes a difference, and we just kind of have to believe that we can get to the tipping point.
The right tipping point.
The right the right tipping point. So small acts multiplied by millions of people can transform the world.
And you know what? I want to talk about in another podcast how it makes a difference if you're making a shift out of fear or out of love. And I
Hmm.
think that
Yeah,
will
there's an
just,
energy that's
yes,
attached to that. Absolutely.
yes. And so for the change for myself and the changes that we've made, we've hugely expanded our garden in the last 10 years. I mean, we do live on a little over an acre, so we have space.
Hmm.
Um, and my husband loves to garden, and that was one of our very deliberate responses to our the information that we know about climate change is that number one, food shortages are going to happen as weather extremes happen, and so it's important to be more self-sufficient if you can. And also it's just a lot healthier, so now we have this abundance of greens and fresh vegetables, and we been canning. My daughter and I have canned corn and carrots this week, and we're going to pickle some beets. So hopefully in the next day or two. And so it becomes something that we do together as a family,
Mm.
and we eat, we preserve. You know, I have to say, I don't garden that much with my husband. He'd like it if I gardened with him a little bit more, but he is a little particular, and I kind of leave it to him to do his thing, but I will help if I have to, but that sort of thing. So it becomes a family thing that we do together, and that has brought more joy in our life. And we have solar panels on our roof. We're part of the microfit program that the previous Ontario government brought in, and so we get paid for all of the directly paid for the energy that those solar panels generate year round. And so that is, you know, a financial bonus for us rather than really bringing a lot more joy in our life. Although I have to say it was pretty awesome, and we put them up in 2010. It was pretty exciting to be the first household in our community with solar panels. A number of other households followed you know, fairly shortly after. So we enjoy that. And our electric car, oh my goodness, it is so fun to drive and not be emitting any carbon while you're driving. And yes, I know
Mhm.
that there's issues even with the production of cars. So it's not like an electric car hasn't had a lot of emissions produced in the production, but it's a lot different than one that puts out carbon dioxide out its tailpipe for its whole lifetime. And so, yeah, it's fun. I mean, a lot of our holidays we go canoe camping in the wilderness, so that's a fairly low carbon activity. And I have to say, my husband's been doing that for years, even before we were concerned about climate change. He's been trying to get me to enjoy canoe camping, but I really have appreciated it in a very different way since I became a climate change activist, because I'm quite connected online, especially when I was blogging every day. So for one thing, it forces me to disconnect. And for another, it just is very grounding and healing for me to experience the wilderness when I know in my heart there's so much hurting of the earth going on. It's very healing to be out in a part of nature that's still intact and pristine.
Yeah, yeah. Those are all good things. I have solar panels in my house too. One of the things I did when I moved into this house. Now my house was built in the mid '60s. So there was a program in Massachusetts at the time that was an energy audit where they came in and they seal all your windows. They have these machines and sensors and everything that see how much cold air can get into your house. And then they had 0% loans that you could have uh, insulation, re-insulated, because the insulation that was to code back in 1966 when my house was built, and what there is now, completely different.
Mhm.
In fact, it was really interesting. They went up into my attic space, and there was insulation in the attic space, but it was only over the main part of the house. And so the eaves and stuff, it didn't have the insulation that went out to the eaves. So obviously the cold air was coming in from the ins. It was still filling that space up there and leaking into my house. And it was like, so that was very interesting.
No,
Um,
that's a wonderful program.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that still exists here in Massachusetts, and it probably does in most states. You could just Google energy audit for your state or your province and see where it is. And shortly thereafter, I put solar panels on my house, and just having the sign in my front yard of the people that were doing the installation, I had neighbors that I had never talked to come, stop, knock on my door, and say, "How did you decide on this company?" And so it opened the door for that. And they're unobtrusive. Hardly ever look up there, but occasionally when I look up there, it does give me the feeling of, oh, I am making a difference. I mean, I don't know that I'm saving money by doing it. That's not the reason that I did it. I did it because I want there to be. I want to set an example.
Mm-hmm.
I want to set an example. And my kids were like, "Mom, you go, Mom." They thought it was awesome, and I was like, "Okay, well, I got a little kudos for that."
So I have a question. Does your energy go back into the grid?
It does.
Okay.
The energy goes back into the grid. Yeah. And I didn't purchase my panels. I leased my panels. So there's a little bit difference there. The way it was working in the States was if you bought your panels, then you were able to deduct the cost as off of your taxes. But because of where I am, as a single woman and, whatever, I didn't have the income level to make a difference. So I opted to lease them.
Mm-hmm.
That was the best way for me to go. But nevertheless, I'm still there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've mentioned a few times I am a gardener. So this year I transformed about half of my front lawn into edibles, which
Wow.
it was kind of last year. Actually had one extra tomato plant, and I was like, oh, I'm just going to poke this in here amongst my flowers, and that tomato plant did so much better than the ones I had growing in the backyard that I was like, oh, next year I'm going to do them in the front. So I did that this year, and then I added eggplant and basil, and so and next year I'm going to add corn. I think it's just
Mm-hmm.
it's taking one step at a time and giving yourself forgiveness. You can't do it all, but what you can do I do believe makes a difference, even if it's just setting an example for somebody else, right?
It sends those ripples out, and
It does.
yeah. And again, I would just say it's so important to do it from an orientation of
Love.
love and joy. You like
Mhm.
gardening.
Mhm.
It improves your quality of life to have a garden now in the front that's doing really well. It's not a
Mhm.
and so think about those kind of changes that to our listeners, and I'd love to hear what other people have made, the changes that they made, if they want to share with us again out of that love for our children and for the planet, but also out of joy. It is possible to be joyful even in this difficult time.
Well, the other thing about gardening, just to extrapolate a little bit more, is that food waste is a huge emitter of CO2. And if you're only going to the grocery store once a week, or even a couple times a week, how many? I know I'm very guilty of it. How many times you get into the grocery store and you go, oh, these look great. Oh, these look great, and you're filling your cart with things, and you come home and you put them in the fridge, and then you really don't get the chance to eat it all. So having a garden is, I go out and pick blueberries in the morning and put them in my cereal, or pick tomatoes for caprese that night. Otherwise, they're just hanging on the vine, so less refrigeration,
Yeah.
less food waste. And then I've really gotten, because I'm into the gardening thing, I've started composting all my food, all my napkins, all that kind of stuff, shredding paper and throwing my shredded paper out there, and using all of that to go back, the nutrients to go back into the soil. So it really feels like I feel like a little earth mama.
Mm-hmm. And
but
you
it's
should.
but it's fun, it gives me joy. It comes from a place of joy.
Mm-hmm. And increasing walking and that sort of thing, it's healthy for your body to walk
Mm-hmm.
to the store, to the post office or whatever, instead of driving. And it's just changing those small habits. I mean, we could.
Well, as you make one step, the next one kind of occurs naturally. So going back to the gardening thing. So now I have rain barrels as well. I was like, well, I'm composting. What else I could change all my gutters to rain barrels so that I'm using the water, and then I have to fill my my watering can from the rain barrel, and I'm getting more exercise, and I'm walking more, and feet on the ground and barefoot on the ground for me, so it's all that kind of becoming an old hippie again.
Or not, for people who aren't the granola type. I know you told me you were eating granola this morning, so that just fits in line with your hippie side. I think that we could talk about this for a long time, because there's a lot of personal changes that we haven't touched on that you and I have made, I'm sure. But let's wrap it up for today. Do we have some good news?
Sure. Well, you've been sending me little snippets all week long of some good news. So I think one of them, in talking about greening things, was in Ethiopia. They planted, how many trees did they plant in 24 hours?
That was in the end of July. They broke a world record, I believe, by the number of tree plantings. Schools and businesses closed, and so the kids could go out and help as well.
Here it is. Ethiopia
breaks world record for most trees planted in a day, and that was back in July. So that is wonderful news, and something that we can all do as well on an individual level, or participate in a community tree planting effort.
I gave up my New York Times subscription. I'm putting that money towards Tree Sisters.
There you go.
Which, Tree Sisters is an organization that they help underprivileged women. They give them jobs planting trees in parts of is it South America?
I think it's around the world, but let's put a link to that. So maybe the action step for today is for people to go and look at the Tree Sisters website and see if it speaks to them. And how about I'm going to put a challenge out there to our listeners to maybe another action step is to share on our Earth Feels Facebook page, or in the comment section of the podcast that you're listening to, what personal actions you've made that have made a difference for you with regards to reducing your carbon footprint, but also increasing the level of joy in your life.
Brilliant.
Okay, so we've got good news, we've got an action step.
So my Sanity Tip is move your body. I went to a concert just recently. I was privileged enough to see Carlos Santana in concert, and it was incredible. So spiritual, but so just, I felt like it opened every chakra, and just moving to the music the entire time. So Sanity Tip, turn on the music in your house and turn off the news and turn off everything else, and just move your body for a short amount of time, 15 minutes, and feel the joy that it is to be a human being.
Lovely.
Yeah.
And thanks for tuning in, folks. We love doing this. We love that you're listening to it. And
and log on to earthfeelspodcast.com, and you can find the notes for all the links that we're talking about.
That's this week's episode of Earth Feels. Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Google Play so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me. You see, our mother, she has been suffering, and the truth is told beneath the